Hello, my name is Harold Furchtgott-Roth, and I would like to welcome you here to the Hudson Institute and the Center for the Economics of the Internet. Today, we'll be discussing the future of spectrum policy in the United States. But first, just one minor housekeeping note. I'd like to welcome you later this week to another session of the Center for the Economics of the Internet when we'll be welcoming former Commissioner Maureen Olhausen to discuss privacy and competition. But today we'll be discussing the future of spectrum policy in the United States, particularly in light of a recent request for information from the Department of Defense. The RFI from the Department of Defense raises some very wonderful topics: dynamic spectrum sharing, 5G. All of this is wonderful and makes sense in ever-changing technology. But it also raises some questions that could be interpreted as getting the Department of Defense involved in the ownership of private networks and leasing access to private entities. To discuss the Department of Defense request for information, we have with us a distinguished panel. Today we have Commissioner Michael O'Rielly of the Federal Communications Commission, former ambassador to the World Radio Conference, Grace Coe, and currently with Nokia, and former FCC Commissioner Robert McDowell, currently with the Cooley Law Firm. Let's begin with Commissioner O'Rielly to discuss the Department of Defense RFI and how it might be different from how spectrum policy has typically been made in the United States. Commissioner O'Rielly.
Well, thank you, Harold, and thank you for my guests for joining me on this important topic. I would say that if you look back at spectrum policy, certainly my time working on these issues since the mid-1990s, but spectrum policy was early as the early 1980s, has been bifurcated. It's between federal spectrum run by or overseen by the National Telecommunications Information Administration and Department of Commerce, and the non-federal spectrum, whether it be for commercial or non-commercial entities, at the Federal Communications Commission. And that those lines have been drawn for quite a while. They're in statute, and they provide, an understanding for the practitioners exactly how things are to be treated and which entity you're subject to. I would suggest that certainly in the last 2 to 4 years, those lines have broken down, and there have been problems with how the federal spectrum has been treated. NTIA has been, in some regards, because the number of administrators have changed, because of the lack of attention to the agency, has lost some of the voice that it once had, in my experience, and that has led to a couple of multiple problems and multiple spectrum bands that have conflicted and caused problems, certainly as relates to the FCC. I think of whether it's 24 gigahertz or 5.9 or legato issues. The federal agencies have stopped listening to NTIA or stopped approaching NTIA and then gone their own direction and used their own lobbying techniques to defend their position. And that gets us to the Department of Defense, the Goliath of spectrum users in the federal side, which holds the majority of spectrum and obviously has the greatest say in the matter. Very important for national security. We certainly all respect that and those positions, but that in terms of spectrum policy, they have somewhat had a backwards approach. And I know there have been different ideas over the time period, and former Commissioner Furchtgott-Roth has explored these as part of CISMAC and how you could break down the lines I talked about. But if you look at the Department of Defense today and what's been talked about in this RFI, I think you really have to question, and really have to scratch your head about what is it we're going direction towards, and how would it be accomplished, and what's the benefit actually being suggested, and all those things, in my opinion, break down. And we really have a really troubling situation before us. The RFI is in my opinion, could be an NOI at the FCC, but what it's getting at is a much larger problematic issue. The idea that the Department of Defense would operate a 5G private network that the entity could use as a wholesale offering to other entities is really, a shift in the direction of what spectrum policy has been, and where it's going and what the roles are. In terms of substance, this really gets into some problematic areas. The two reasons that I've been given, and there's multiple reasons people suggest, this has been something that's been talked about for quite a while, but the two reasons people seem to suggest why this has to go forward from a wholesale perspective. One is that only a wholesale network can reach every corner of America. The drop zones that we have today under the multiple provider method and the private sector method for 5G wouldn't exist if you had one provider that was, that had a wholesale model. And I just think that's completely wrong and proven out by the facts. And then two is the idea that it would be faster and better and more secure if you had this wholesale network with the thousands of partners that it has than the existing providers and the existing, American capitalism, which has driven our wireless providers to reach out and build out 5G as fast as possible. This network would be years behind that for multiple reasons, but somehow that would be a better structure. Is really problematic from my viewpoint. So we're really heading in a really dark corner by putting out this RFI, and certainly when you hear in town talk about an RFP. And in terms of actually contracting for this, I think is a really troubling direction for spectrum policy overall.
Former Ambassador Koch, could you tell us a bit about how American spectrum policy has been developed and how it's been coordinated internationally at the State Department, and how the Department of Defense historically has participated in that process?
Yes, and again, just want to echo the Commissioner's thanks for having us here to discuss this very strange, I think, occurrence in spectrum policy. Yeah, so from my experience, actually, both looking from the outside when I was working on the Hill during the Obama administration, spectrum policy on the federal level is often coordinated through the Interdepartmental Radio Advisory Committee. So the idea here really is the way much of the government works generally. There are always going to be competing interests and competing equities that are fighting for the use of a scarce resource, especially in the way that we allocate it. And there must be coordination and sort of a coordinator to figure out how to allocate this resource in a very sane way. The FCC has a seat on this advisory committee. NTIA chairs this advisory committee, but DoD, NASA, DOT, all of the other organizations that do make use of spectrum within the federal government have a seat and are able to have their say. But what you have there is an advisory committee. It's to some degree, it helps to set policy, but really policy needs to be coordinated through NTIA and through the White House. And what I can say from one of my jobs, from the vantage point of my former job at the National Economic Council, one of the things that we are sorely lacking in is a national spectrum strategy. This is something that was tasked to the NTIA and due to come out a bit ago, but I can't really say how much time has elapsed since it actually was supposed to come out. But the idea of putting out that strategy, or even having an executive order in the first place, which the Obama administration had also done, is to gather the interagency, is to gather all of the equities that have a use for spectrum, put them in a room and make them fight it out, and make them come to a consensus over what is going to be prioritized. It has been very clear in many respects that 5G is a huge priority for the United States. 5G, and as Larry Kudlow has said multiple times, and a number of other major cabinet level figures, the 5G built by private industry is a huge priority. And at the same time, you have others also piping in, saying that there are a variety of other priorities that have a claim on spectrum usage as well. And those priorities haven't been sorted, and there hasn't been a willingness to come off this, to come to a consensus. There has been no sort of real drive to sort of ensure that people are on the same page as to what's going to be pushed through. So you have 5G, you have space, you have national security, you have driverless cars, you have all sorts of other priorities that are just floating out there in a way without sort of a real organizing principle, which the effort to get a spectrum strategy was supposed to help organize. Now that in itself says that it's probably a very difficult debate that they are having, and that there's no real willingness on the part of any of these agencies to really sort of give. That has been the way things have worked. I don't know that this is necessarily the way things need to keep going forward, but I am really hesitant to say that one priority should trump another, shouldn't necessarily, take priority over another unless you can get consensus from that group. When we set priorities for the World Radio Communication Conference, we had 3 years to build upon of ensuring that 5G was going to be, and the question there had been set from the previous administration, that 5G was going to be very important, and it was going to be the main priority. Acquiring millimeter wave spectrum for 5G was going to be extremely important for the U.S. in the world, in its goals for the World Radio Communication Conference. That priority was echoed by this administration, and it continued to be a priority. And so we were able to find some guiding principle to help move this along. Our international policy is created by looking at our domestic policy and trying to understand what works best for our industries in the United States and positions the United States in the best possible light for competition in the future. And that's how we would typically derive this. But you do hear from all of the various equities and also from various industries, as well as you were seeking to make that work. It continues to be very cacophonous.
Thank you. Rob McDowell, tell us a bit about what all of this means to you. How does this look in terms of the future of spectrum policy in the United States?
Sure, and so just to refresh folks listening, what the Pentagon has put out is a request for information with a lot of questions on it. I have a copy of it right here. One of which, though, the first question is, how could DoD own and operate 5G networks for its domestic operation? And then it goes on from there. It doesn't explicitly talk about a nationalized 5G plan, but does ask questions about whether or not it should be a wholesale operator. So it begs a lot of questions. And I hope folks comment. Comments are due on October 19th, Department of Defense. But one of which is, does the Department of Defense need spectrum over every square inch of the United States domestically? This is terrestrial spectrum. They have military bases that are pretty well broadband saturated, with a couple of exceptions, maybe in Alaska. But is that really needed? Do they need to have their own 5G network in civilian areas? I like to say downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma, let's say. The answer is probably not. So are they trying to emulate the FirstNet example, which was something that was worked on for years? And I know Grace worked on it on Capitol Hill. I think probably Mike O'Rielly did too, of the nationwide public safety interoperable high-speed wireless network that was envisioned after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and also Hurricane Katrina. So why would the Department of Defense need that? For their aircraft, they have use of spectrum. When they are fighting wars abroad, they have use of spectrum. So that's one question. Another question is, how can it trump, to use Grace's word, the statutory role of the Department of Commerce through NTIA and the FCC? As Commissioner O'Rielly laid out, NTIA is in charge of federal spectrum, and the FCC is in charge of private sector management of spectrum, as well as state and local public safety spectrum, so your local fire and rescue and sheriffs and stuff like that. So the Department of Defense can't just simply say, hey, we're going to lease our spectrum and we're going to the private sector, and we're going to come up with the rules for how that should be managed. It doesn't have statutory authority to do that. It also has two other statutory obstacles to overcome. And this is where the talk gets really exciting. The Miscellaneous Receipts Act, I'm sure that puts goose pimples over anyone who's listening, says that any government agency can't, let's say, have a bake sale and then pocket the proceeds into its own budget from the bake sale. In this case, the bake sale would be a spectrum lease or something else where they're deriving revenue from the private sector. It just simply can't do that under the Miscellaneous Receipts Act. And then the kind of other side of that coin is the Anti-Deficiency Act. Anti-Deficiency Act says the federal government can't spend money essentially unless it's authorized to do so from Congress. So it can't raise money and put it in its own pocket unless it's authorized by Congress, and it can't spend money for a specific purpose. And that comes out of Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, by the way. That's the constitutional grounding for that particular statute, the Anti-Deficiency Act. So I'm sure there are a number of great DoD lawyers who've looked at this. Those statutes are not cited directly in the request for information, but there are reasons for these things so that agencies throughout government can't just willy-nilly start doing things on their own without Congress saying it's okay. So should this go from an RFI, just a request for information, they just want to hear people's views, to something more formal like a request for proposal, that would be the beginning of the government contracting process. They're going to have a lot of legal questions to answer. And I sense there would be some appellate action. Someone's going to go to court over whether or not this should be the case. And then lastly, there's a lot more to discuss, but the other thing that's on my mind in response to your question is, what does this do to the private sector? So America has led the world in mobile wireless technology since Marty Cooper stepped out onto 6th Avenue in April of 1973 and placed that first phone call, that first cellular phone call. We have invested since 1996 as a country about $1.7 trillion of private risk capital into our wireless networks and all those things associated with them. We need about another 300 billion or so to finish building out our 5G networks here in this country. And there are a lot of spectrum requirements under spectrum licenses through the FCC that Commissioner O'Rielly has worked on to build out those 5G networks quickly. So if I've been asked by investor clients, sort of Wall Street clients, I'll call them, and others, if the government's going to get into the 5G game, what does this do to the risk of that private risk capital that's out there? What does it do in the return on investment? And while there won't be a zeroing out of capital expenditures or loans from, let's say, banks to wireless carriers to build out, there won't be, that won't come to a screeching halt, but it will, at a minimum, that uncertainty that's created by the government even thinking about this can drive up the cost of capital. And what that means is there's less money for 5G build out. So if an interest rate is higher or a fee is higher, in order to hedge against potential risk of a fifth national wireless carrier to come into the market that has zero cost of capital, its parent company, if you will, the United States government can print its own money, and it has no profit incentive, it could all of a sudden very harmfully distort the capital markets as well as the retail markets ultimately. So just teeing this up creates these questions from those who will be lending money to the carriers and tower companies and equipment makers and such about what does this mean? And it can trim the sales and investment, drive up that cost of capital, because if you're wireless carrier X and you're borrowing tens of billions of dollars, all of a sudden your interest rate goes up, you're paying more money for that loan, and that's money that's diverted from the actual investment in building out. So these are all huge questions. We'll see where it goes. Maybe this stops as a request for information, and maybe it continues to plow on into a different direction. And we can talk later about how this might transcend the administration if there's a change in the White House party.
Thank you very much. It seems that the RFI has both some good elements and some bad elements. The good elements probably are related to reviewing dynamic spectrum allocation, and instead of being passive about it, the Department of Defense is actually actively asking questions. Can it share spectrum? How would it go about doing it? Which bands make sense? And usually agencies are more passive about this rather than being out in front on it. So I think there may be some good aspects of that. But I think all three of you have pointed out the aspects of the RFI and the RFI itself it's a very short document. We could probably even read it here, but I'm not going to bore you with that. And it's written in fairly, I'll call it vague language. You could read it to me in a very benign way, or you can also read it in a non-benign way. And it seems that each of you is reading this in at least potentially not an entirely benign way. I'd like to focus on just two issues and have you each address these. One is there's some countries around the world that have developed wireless and spectrum policy based on government ownership and government influence on how these things are developed. I'm not going to name the countries. There are probably just a handful of them, and they're not usually our friends. Most other countries have developed spectrum policy that is entirely private sector centric, really following on the example of the United States for the past 35 years. Is the DoD RFI kind of hinting at a different approach, or is it not? And the second question I'd like to tee up for you is and I think each of you has also touched on this, which is how should spectrum policy within the administration be made? Should it be made in a centralized way, either at NTIA or in the White House or at the FCC, but let's focus on just federal spectrum at NTIA or the White House? Or should it be done at each cabinet agency, looking at their spectrum holdings and trying to figure out what to do? Commissioner O'Rielly, two very open-ended questions. Let me start with you.
Sure. Well, I would suggest that you're giving too much credit, and your first question is related to this, RFI. I would say that DoD is already advanced and experienced on spectrum sharing. We have the CBRS model that the FCC worked in partnership with them for many, many years. And now we're getting the fruits of our labor, making it operational. And so both on the unlicensed like side and on the licensed side, which we've just gone through an extensive auction for. So I think that we know what spectrum sharing can be on the DoD side. I think this is I think there are, within the document, and the document, as you say, there are a bunch of questions, and certainly Commissioner McDowell raises, there's a bunch of questions in there, but I think it hides its real intent, which is to get to the complete model change that it's seeking to go towards. It's trying to move away from having any type of role of an IRAC at NTIA, a Department of Commerce, overseeing any part of those issues. And I think that's incredibly problematic. For decades, the U.S. position has been to basically export our spectrum model internationally. Have an independent regulator on non-federal spectrum. Certainly would love to expand that to the federal side to have some more efficiencies. I certainly worked on spectrum policy in Congress to oversee the aspect when NTIA was still using actual paper licenses and had a card catalog for how backwards their system is in terms of who's which agencies operating at which spectrum band. So it's not a model that you want to copy, but we have certainly tried to copy the FCC model and have independent regulators making decisions based on sound science and sound engineering. And this is a move, in my opinion, directly away from that. And it's basically asking the question, how can DoD, which has a number of spectrum bands for national security purposes, use it for something else that it may see as beneficial? That is incredibly problematic from my viewpoint, and would require something that add to the list of statutes that Commissioner McDowell mentioned, but would require a complete approval from the FCC, because maybe NTIA can sign off on this, maybe they don't need it, and DoD can go forward and do what it wants on that side of the equation. But for any network to build, any provider, and there'll probably be a number that will raise their hand and say, I'll build it if you're going to give me a bunch of money and the spectrum to do so. But for anyone to actually use it, to provide commercial service to somebody on the outside, they have to get FCC approval. And I will tell you, all 5 commissioners, and I will be departing, and maybe some others will leave the commission, but all 5 commissioners, rejected this multiple times at a recent House hearing. And I suspect that any commissioner or any potential nominee to the commission going forward is going to have to answer that question. There have been a bunch of issues that become telltale sign at the commission, and how do you get approval through? How do you get past holds and things like this? I would suggest to people, this will be one of those issues that if you support some kind of mechanism that that deviates from sound spectrum policy that we have, and that you would authorize DoD to move forward in this direction, you're going to have a problem getting through and getting approval by the U.S. Senate into that role, and therefore I believe there's going to be unanimous opposition, in my opinion, from the commission going forward, and therefore you're not going to see the dollars be invested. You're going to see this network, and we've seen this time and time again. Someone promises something. And someone builds it, and then no one uses it. And if you talk to the providers themselves, you ask them the question, would you be interested in a wholesale model where you can, get, and they all will turn their head and say, absolutely not. They won't do that in public because they may be the ones that want to raise their hand to build it, but they don't want to actually use it. And that to me is a broken model. And it's not just something that's, it's not this, beneficial examination of spectrum policy that we hope it to be. It's actually intended for, a much more narrow purpose to get to this direction I think is completely broken.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Former Ambassador Coe, would you like to weigh in on these questions?
Yeah, thank you. So I think this RFI is a little bit like a Rorschach test, right? You kind of see what you see in it, right? And as you pointed out, Commissioner Furchtgott-Roth, you can see some very benign aspects and some very positive aspects. You can also see some real trouble, as Commissioner O'Rielly has clearly pointed out. And I think there is a lot of room for mischief, but I do think that what DoD has done to some degree is simply thrown a bomb into the works, into the discussion, and maybe purposefully so. I think that they are quite fed up actually with the notion that they are constantly sort of having to give spectrum and make it available for reclamation by commercial entities. And I think they are trying to change the conversation desperately. Now, I know they've started up quite a hornet's nest in doing so, but I think that what they are looking for in God's honest truth is a real discussion on sharing and sensing and trying to figure out how we move forward here, which I don't think necessarily is a bad thing. I think this is a conversation that we need to have given the increasing scarcity of spectrum and the increasing number of uses. I do think that it is available for exploitation by people who are interested, and I do think that there are elements in the government and private sector that are interested in a nationalized network and would like to see something like that happen. And I think that they can hijack this RFI to bring that to fruition. But I think and the hue and cry sort of that's resulting from it is it's a very clear sign that not everyone's going to be comfortable with that idea, and I think it's a necessary act. As for whether we continue to this model for spectrum allocation, the DoD sort of has stepped out. I don't think that maybe that this RFI was vetted through the IRAC, as that I mentioned earlier. Certainly, I think Commissioner O'Rielly can say that it probably wasn't coordinated with the FCC, or not even with NTIA. And but I will say that it was likely vetted very heavily through the DoD. This is not something that just comes out. The DoD, if it is anything, is a massive stodgy bureaucracy, and you have to vet things over 100 times before you can actually put it out into public. So they very clearly, I think, put something out there that was going to be a bit of a bomb, and they know that it's coming. So I would be interested in seeing what the real reaction is going to be, and whether there are pressures from other elements in the government or private sector that would like them to push out an RFP, or if the folks at DoD are thinking otherwise, that they'll do something else with it. Maybe it is to think about a different model for managing spectrum, which it's hard to say what a better model for managing spectrum would be, given that each equity that we have, that we talk about, national security, technological leadership of the United States, is just so important. Both equities are so important. But right now, I think that we are we are not making use of the consensus process that we have used in the past. And I think, to some degree, personnel is policy. You need to have a real head of NTIA in order to be able to make that happen at this point. We have only had acting heads for the past couple of years. And I think not having that has been very detrimental. Do we change this sort of consensus-driven model because we don't have the personnel to staff it? I don't know for certain, but I'd love to hear what my colleagues here have to say on this.
Great, thank you so much. Commissioner McDowell, what do you have to say about these questions?
So there's a lot here, obviously, to unpack. And so the elephant in the room is whether or not there will be a nationalized 5G network. So state-owned, state-leased spectrum. And that by definition is socialism. That's not a pejorative term. The definition of socialism, textbook definition, and I'll defer to the only PhD economist during this event right now, Harold Furchtgott-Roth, to define it for us, but that is when the government owns the means of production. So to build on something that Commissioner O'Rielly said in his opening remarks, which is if this is being sold as somehow speeding or improving deployment of 5G services to hard to reach areas, then we could make that argument. I disagree with the premise, by the way. It will undermine that effort, by the way, in my view. But we could make that argument then on behalf of any industry, that all industries, therefore, should be owned and operated, in a public-private partnership, but really with the government being the dominant partner there. So we need to be careful what we wish for and the precedent that's being set here. Ambassador Coe also referred to the lack of a comprehensive spectrum policy by the administration, and there have been rumors of one emerging a couple of years ago, and then it never did. I do want to give kudos, though, currently to the FCC. The FCC in the past 3+ years has repurposed almost 5,500 megahertz worth of spectrum, which if you had told me that was going to happen 4 years ago, I would have laughed. I mean, that's incredible. Not all that's for 5G, some is for unlicensed or other purposes, but that is a Herculean effort. And as everyone knows, it takes a while to move that spectrum through the spectrum pipeline, to go from being theoretical to actually having discernible government action, to then either auctioning it or somehow repurposing it, whether it's a sharing regime or whatever, and then to actually have it lit up and in the hands of consumers. I used to say when I was at the commission over 7 years ago when I left, and it's still true today, it takes the better part of a decade to get through that process. So we will start to see the fruits of this FCC's spectrum repurposing efforts really start to come to bear or fall into the hands of consumers here over the coming years. And so I want folks to keep that in mind. There are some good ideas in the RFI, good questions, I would say, which is what to do about spectrum sharing. My bias is towards having exclusive use licenses that you auction. That is the closest thing when you use the land or real estate analogy for spectrum. That's the closest analogy. It's yours through an exclusive use license with flexible use policies, so that you can use that spectrum for whatever the market dictates, provided it does not cause harmful interference to other neighboring licensees. Sharing is a little bit different, and it's an amorphous term, and it can be in a number of contexts. It can be sharing based on geography or time of day or both, power levels. There's all sorts of ways to condition or restrict private sector use, sharing side by side with government users. And it can be efficient where auctions for exclusive use licenses just doesn't make any sense. But we have seen, as we just saw, two Nobel economists, two Nobel laureates emerge yesterday for their work on auction theory, some of which was incorporated into the FCC's auction theory that unfolded when Harold Furchtgott-Roth was a commissioner. We all have to, of course, thank Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel back in, I think, 1992, and in part was laughed out of the room in the late 1950s, early 60s when he wrote his paper saying that the FCC should auction its spectrum. But that is a better way to go. That is, history has proven this. It's demonstrable that it's the best way to go as often as you can. Now, in defense of the Defense Department, I want our U.S. defenses, our American Defense Department, to be the best in the world forever and for always. I believe in peace through strength, and they need to have adequate spectrum available to them at a moment's notice. So that's hopefully a given that everyone can agree on. But, you know, during my service on the FCC for 7 years, having looked at a lot of the uses of federal spectrum, may not be DoD, it could be Department of Transportation, Department of Interior, there are a lot of agencies that use spectrum. Not all of it, I think we can safely say, is being used efficiently. And with spectral efficiency gaining every day, we have that sort of like Moore's law, called Cooper's law, actually doubles every 2.5 years. And with our brilliant entrepreneurs and engineers that are finding uses of frequencies that were once considered unusable for either terrestrial or satellite purposes every day, more spectrum in a way becomes available. Therefore, the federal government could free up more spectrum for private sector uses. So I do think, and I've always maintained, that we are in the early days of the golden age of wireless. We haven't seen or even smelled the best of it yet. That'll come in the decades to come. And so this RFP, when it does tee up a discussion about dynamic spectrum sharing, I think there's a lot of potential there, and we're going to see jaw-dropping innovation in the coming years. So hopefully it could be a win-win. We need to kind of govern or regulate from the theory of abundance, creating abundance incentives to produce rather than ration. And my concern with the nationalized 5G network is that it would undermine all the progress we've made as a country in the past 40 years in wireless.
Thank you. It's not entirely uncommon for governments to think about technology and to think that they can plot out the course of future technologies. Usually governments have been very unsuccessful in trying to lead innovation, to lead technology. Several years ago, China's government developed certain national strategic initiatives. One was the Belt and Road Program. Another was 5G. They wanted to dominate the world for 5G. It was a very ambitious project, and arguably every other time a centralized government, a Politburo, if you will, decided they were going to have some technological objective, they always failed. This time might be different. It's quite arguable that China's strategic initiative on 5G, in fact, has worked. A lot of people tend to believe that. And what I would like to do is to pose to you the question, is there something different about 5G? Is there something that says that national governments should be taking over technology and taking over services that once were provided by the private sector? Or alternatively, is the private sector the engine of innovation? Is the private sector better positioned to advance technology? And does the DoD RFI really put these questions in very sharp contrast and present a way of looking at the future of spectrum policy in the United States? Do we go down a course that's similar to the China model, which is to say the government will be in charge, or do we continue on the path of having the private sector in charge? Commissioner O'Rielly.
Well, I would completely respectfully reject the notion that China is winning the 5G race. If you give anyone unlimited amounts of money and unlimited control, they're going to be they could be in a pretty good position. And I think that's where you find China today. There are things that we can learn from that. For instance, we need to be able to deploy our networks in a very thoughtful and in a streamlined manner, and that's why the Commission has gone aggressively to address barriers to deployment, such as state and local government, whether it be statutory objections or or procedures. So the things that we can learn from their model. But I would argue that, and you presented it quite nicely, that the private sector provides the innovation that China has never been able to copy. And they have spent countless hours and sent countless people to try and study abroad and certainly in the United States to learn how to capture the innovation, component, and they've never been able to do it. And so I think that that's something that only happens through the American capitalism model or capitalism in general. The only way that you get that fierce innovation comes from competition, comes from the private sector trying to figure out how to return on investment and get deployment as soon as possible for the betterment of the company itself and those it's serving. Is through that model. So I think that the China model is broken, and while it can be in a lead position in certain instances, in certain circumstances, their country, very diverse in terms of geography, in terms of where the people are located, the density that they have can provide and make it look like their numbers are astronomical compared to the United States. But I think we're in a very good position, and the competitive and private sector companies, the wireless providers of the United States are the envy of the world for that reason, that they're doing wonderful deployment of 5G in the United States, and their partnerships and ownership internationally is also expanding. And that's a separate conversation from the security issue. How do you deal with the ongoing disagreement, very right discussion and debate over national security concerns and the ability of networks to protect information from nation states or rogue elements or the capture of information. It's a little bit different, but I don't think, I think the first, the questions you ask, I think is undoubtedly in the position that the United States model will succeed over over China or any other socialist network that is contemplated or attempted or even out in the field as China's is today. And so I think we're going to do very well, and our providers are doing extraordinary work given the circumstances. And what our job is certainly as a regulator for a couple more months, in my perspective, is to expand those opportunities and make sure that the barriers to deployment and the access to spectrum that the Commissioner McDowell talked about, how long it takes to get into the pipeline, that we address that as soon as possible, and we address it over and over and over. And something I've been working really hard to do is how do you get more spectrum in the next pipeline? We've done great work in the last 4 years, in my opinion, over the 7 years of my time period. If you look at what we did in the last couple of years with Tom Wheeler at head, I worked hard on millimeter wave, and then I shifted to midband, and everyone rushes to midband. We've done great work in getting spectrum bands out into the private sector. And the real question becomes, what's next? What's the next opportunity? And that coincides nicely with the topic that we present today, because I've been pushing for more spectrum is going to be needed to be reallocated from the Department of Defense, that they're inefficiently using it today, and we're going to need to shrink their footprint and make them more efficient, and also upgrade their equipment in the process so they can better meet the national security needs and also provide the opportunity for the next spectrum pipeline, which does not exist today.
Thank you, Commissioner. Ambassador Coe.
You asked, Commissioner, that what makes 5G different to some degree, and it sort of makes it more perhaps compatible with centralized governments or nationalized takeovers. I do think that the big primary difference, I think, between 4G and 5G is probably the scale on deployment, which scale that's required for deployment, which is very compatible with a centralized government. But quite honestly, and that's, why China has been able to throw a lot of money, a lot of spectrum, a lot of, zoning permits or whatever is used or the equivalent thereof in China. And so been able to do as much as they can to facilitate deployment. But I also think that our FCC has done a ton in terms of getting out spectrum and also getting streamlining infrastructure and paving the way for that. that's pretty much the only sort of real compatibility that I see there. But I do want to say centralization doesn't therefore mean nationalization. I think we can do things in order to be able to get to the place where we're able to facilitate deployment and really juice our national sort of launch of 5G, where I think government can be particularly helpful. Not only in the spectrum discussion, the willingness to engage in determining what can be done in terms of making spectrum available, whether it is exclusive licenses and reclamation or dynamic access to spectrum, is to discuss use cases. I think the United States government has the most interesting use cases, especially when it comes to things like national security, which are actually going to be very relevant to commercial networks as we continue to fight against cyber incursions and other things. But the United States governments can provide some of the most robust use cases that are out there in order for us to build, to invent better apps and services that really take advantage of all the incredible, I think, innovations and advancements that 5G can bring. I think that's, sandboxing with DoD or sandboxing with DOT would be very helpful in order for us to be able to move and leap forward very quickly. So there is a really good role for government in the deployment of 5G and also in the race to, I keep telling myself I'm not going to say race to 5G anymore, but in our effort to continue to lead technologically in 5G, and I would hope that that's something that we would that the DoD RFI, the responses to the DoD RFI also takes into consideration, that we can do a lot of good work when it comes to actually building out use cases and figuring out what those edge cases of 5G can be used for.
Great. Thank you very much. Rob McDowell.
So we've seen a little bit of the ghost of Christmas future, if you will, of state-run broadband. A number of municipalities over the years have tried to build and operate their own municipal broadband networks. And almost without exception, they've been a failure. So the University of Pennsylvania a little while ago did a study of about 20 different projects that they could find the financial data on. And this is a Professor Chris Yu and Professor Timothy Fenninger. And so they looked at those 20, 11 generated negative cash flow. 5 would be projected to take more than 100 years to recover their costs. And 2 others were projected to take only 60 years to recover their costs. 2 were on a break-even track. That was in a very densely populated, highly urban area where there was a lot of other broadband available. That is, we've seen, by the way, Russia, we've seen South Africa and Mexico actually attempt some of these, and I know Ambassador Coe knows about those. They've all failed. And that's because governments just don't know how to run businesses, especially one that's as dynamic, as quickly changing as wireless is. There's a ton of new innovation every day, and that comes about because of competition, this sort of healthy paranoia among competitors. So keep that in mind, that not only is it a bad idea, it's the law right now that the federal government can't be using its spectrum for a nationalized 5G network. I do have concerns that this idea we've heard discussed a couple of times during this administration. I've analogized it to sort of the Freddy Krueger villain from horror movies. When you think he's dead, he comes back to life for the sequel. That when we think the nationalized 5G network idea is dead, it only comes back to life. And that could be the case regardless of who wins the presidential election on November the 3rd. There, for different reasons, as Commissioner O'Rielly pointed out early on, whether it's trying to build out faster to rural America as the pretext, or to help the unserved and underserved in any area, be it urban or suburban or rural, there will always be a pretext or a reason as to why the government needs to do this. Or, by the way, to raise money for government agencies. And again, the best way to do that is through auctions, and that auction money goes into the general treasury. Great op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal about exactly how efficient that is in spectrum auctions. And we're recording this on October 13th, by the way. So it's a bad idea. Time and time again, government-run broadband networks fail. And then the other concept is, and I'd love to hear Ambassador Coe's sort of reaction to this. And when I was commissioner, I went to a number of diplomatic meetings regarding spectrum, and Ambassador Coe was the lead diplomat for the World Radio Communication Conference negotiations this last time around, and led the U.S. delegation. But I do know this in the Title II fight. That's the repeated attempt to try to classify broadband as a common carrier service rather than an information service, which brings up all sorts of implications, legal and policy implications, including triggering treaty language regarding whether or not the International Telecommunication Union would have jurisdiction over certain aspects of internet, how the internet is operated, without going into too much detail. But it's a mess. But if the United States does something, whether it's Title II classification, and I'm not analogizing this necessarily to a nationalized or socialized 5G network, or a socialized 5G network, then it's harder for us to tell other countries, you shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be having the state run your industrial output for anything. We lose all credibility. So not only is it a bad idea, which would undermine capital markets and ultimately harm consumers, I think, by stunting CapEx and innovation, but also we start to lose the argument globally as well. And that would have ramifications in an adverse way.
Absolutely agree, Rob. In fact, I'm lucky to be on a panel today with two commissioners who have actually expressed an interest in keeping an eye on the ITU and its reach into domestic sovereignty. I have to thank Commissioner O'Rielly for coming over to Sharm el-Sheikh, and I think he can attest also to the keen interest that other governments have in how we are actually doing auctions, conducting spectrum policy, and there is a real interest in following what the United States does as examples. Now, if we suddenly do an about face, and I'm all in favor of being flexible and practical when it comes to policy, but it makes it harder for us to make those same arguments when we're dealing with other countries to have trade talks or other diplomatic talks that are set on a level playing field for our companies. And so it becomes, I think it would be a stumbling block for us very much in the message that we're bringing to the world.
Well, thank you. I'm going to let each of you do we'll have a final round of comments. I would say that I worry a bit that in the inimitable words of former President George W. Bush, we may be misunderestimating China. They're doing very well. They're doing very well in China. They're doing very well around the world. They're selling lots of gear. Companies in competition with Ambassador Coe's new company. And they're doing it in part because they actually have done a lot of innovation. I think it would be incorrect to say that they haven't. They also do it through a lot of government subsidies of exports, and they're a very formidable player in the 5G space. And I just think it would be a mistake to think that that they are somehow losing. Not that there's a race. I completely agree with Ambassador Coe. I don't like the analogy of this being a foot race. Technological innovation benefits all consumers everywhere. And we are a big proponent of that. But there is a different way of doing this. China has been doing it in a very different way. And they've been frighteningly successful. And in the history of human history, there's always this struggle between does centralization prevail, or does decentralization prevail. And up until now, decentralization has a really good track record. China is putting that track record to a very formal test, and this will be, I think 5G is a test, not just of the future of spectrum policy or of consumer policy, if you will, but also economic policy. Can a government set in its sight the development of a new technology and say this is a national initiative and we're gonna beat the world at it, and then go off and succeed? And what does that mean? And you're right. I mean, countries look at the United States, they look at our auctions, they look at these other things, but they also look over at China, and it's not it's not a failed enterprise over there, and we need to be very careful about that. So I'll get off my soapbox. I'll let each of you have your final remarks as well. Commissioner O'Rielly.
Well, I wouldn't disagree with your point. I would just suggest to you that they are the Houston Astros of spectrum policy, whereas they're succeeding by copying or stealing innovation. They are succeeding by using resources from all of the people, and in some instances, there are people in China going hungry because the money has been diverted for this purpose. So I think, and they also use underhanded techniques globally in many countries to succeed and lock in countries to be committed to their particular state-sponsored company. So I think there are problems with it. I think that they lack certain things to succeed. That doesn't mean they're not doing well. It just means that they have used certain techniques that we wouldn't approve here. I do think that centralization, and you framed it nicely. Can a government have a policy, an essential policy, and then succeed at it? And then what does that mean? And I think we do have a United States policy that 5G is important, and we're going to lead the world in deployment of that technology. It's a means in how we go about doing it that's different than some other countries, such as China. We're going to let the private sector, we're going to provide them the resources in terms of spectrum. We're going to get the barriers out of the way, and we're going to let them provide the service and deploy using competitive markets as a force, and that's a successful avenue. The things, the deviations from that are things like the RFI from the Department of Defense, which seeks to move away from that policy, which seeks to head towards a more, more government-driven, use of a resource for its own particular, good versus the betterment of spectrum policy. And they've got a resource they pay no cost to. There's no inventory of how much they have, and no one can effectively challenge any aspect of their spectrum usage. That's a problem in my book, and that's why I've pushed so long and so hard to fix those things, both at the FCC, both throughout our federal government, and at the U.S. Congress. I testified many times on this. So my final thought is, is to say to people, this, the idea of the RFP is fine to ask all the questions you want. You can ask all the misguided questions you want, but actually taking action on that would be a problem, and it should not be allowed to move forward. And I would suggest that the FCC would never approve such thing. So any company that wants to believe that they're going to be able to use this network is misguided.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Coe.
Thanks very much. And firmly, was nodding my head so hard that I thought it was going to fall off. But agree absolutely with Commissioner O'Rielly. And I just want to also say that I'm sorry that you won't be there after a few months. Thank you very much for your really, really great service. And I think I can say that for everybody here. On China, I think they're acting very rationally. They have a 1.4 billion strong nation. They need to produce. They need to continue to drive that economic growth. So what they are doing is entirely rational in their minds, and I think rational from other people's points of views. The question is, the tactics they're using are not necessarily ones that we would argue are part of a liberal democracy, or that's part of the global trading order. One thing to note, they are pretty young in diplomacy still, so they are making a lot of missteps, as Commissioner O'Rielly pointed out, and I think we should be able to take advantage of those missteps by doing a number of things. first, continuing to do as much to speed access to spectrum and centralize infrastructure siting issues. Also, to consider, how we are encouraging or incentivizing R&D, standards development activities here in the United States. That's a centralized policy that I think we can do without feeling that we've completely left our free market roots. And also considering what our investment entities can do overseas. So things like what was used to be called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation is now the Development Financing Corporation, what they can do, what strings we can tie to other multilateral development banks. So I think that there are things that we can do abroad through the government regardless. As for the spectrum access question, I've always been in the camp that a nationalized network is not the United States, not the American way. However, the DoD RFI, the specter of the nationalized network and the DoD RFI is concerning, but I think we also need to consider the other questions that have been raised on what other sorts of models of spectrum access are we going to need, because that time is coming when we are not going to have the ability to simply clear out spectrum, and we need to think about how that really how that plays out in the future. So for what Nokia is definitely interested in discussing with DoD how network slicing, incumbent informing systems, and other things can actually help to create more access and more efficiency out of the spectrum. So we're hopeful about that. Certainly, I think we would like to continue to work with DoD on strengthening our research and our use cases so that we can understand what 5G will be used for, because all of us, even China, still does not know exactly what we're going to do with 5G. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner McDowell.
Well, thank you. To build on what Grace was just saying too, I was at the commission when we started the spectrum auctions that led to 4G, and trying to get rid of this phone call is interrupting me right now. In any case, we had no idea, the best and the brightest, exactly what the 4G economy would lead to. Nobody of the best and the brightest foresaw the app economy evolve the way it did. So keep that in mind. To Grace's point, we don't know what wonderful things 5G is going to spawn. We know it'll be faster and higher throughputs, and so that's all great. But where does that lead? And it's net. I tend to be an optimist for all the bad things that come with more connectivity, such as robocalls, like I was probably just getting. That they're net are more positive things. I would like to lead actually to then with a thank you to Commissioner O'Rielly. He has served with great distinction. I don't know if this will be the last time I serve on a panel with you. I'm not sure if I've ever actually served on a panel with you before, but so this is a great honor. I have obviously a personal aspect to this. I've known Commissioner O'Rielly for a long time, number of years, and he serves in the seat that I used to occupy, and I think he's done a fantastic job. I know he'll do great in the private sector, and I hope he returns to public service someday, maybe sooner rather than later. I'd also like to thank Hudson Institute for putting this together, and you, Harold Furchtgott-Roth, former FCC Commissioner and the only PhD economist who had served on the FCC. It's a great topic. I think we might all need to reconvene here in a little while if there is an RFP issued, and regardless of the outcome of the election. And I also should have said as a housekeeping matter at the beginning, and I'm doing this all backwards, that I'm speaking only on my own behalf. My law firm has thousands of clients, and some of them might have perspectives, and I sit on boards and other things. I have not conferred with anybody prior to making these remarks. These are purely my own remarks. But the bottom line, I think, for this particular subject is to believe in markets. The past should be prologue in this case. The past is the best illustration of what the future would look like. So that think about that $1.7 trillion that's been spent in the United States on wireless infrastructure since 1996, and the hundreds of billions more that are going to come. And that innovation only comes through that benevolent chaos of the private sector, all that constructive risk-taking. Command and control doesn't work. It suppresses innovation, it drives up prices, and it ultimately harms consumers. We can prove this in a number of ways. It's demonstrable. time has proven that the private sector is the best allocator, and consumers stand to benefit when we rely on the private sector. So I hope the Pentagon doesn't try to go in this direction, but if they do, I think they're going to have big problems in court and they'll be turned back legally. I don't see legally how they could go forward with these ideas that we keep hearing about. So thank you again. This is terrific to have put together this panel, and I have a funny feeling we'll all be back here again before we know it to talk about it some more.
Well, I would like to thank all the panelists for an outstanding session today, and look forward to seeing each of you in the near future. And I echo the thoughts about Commissioner O'Rielly, whom I've known for a quarter of a century or more. Probably we were both in kindergarten at the time. So with that, thank you all very much. And please join us again later this week for the session with Commissioner Olhouse on privacy and competition.